With that said, please help me welcome my friend Nick Smaligo, local author and member of the Flyover Social Center, presenting Carbondale Springs Police Budget Initiative.
Thank you all for coming. This is amazing. Last year, the Carbondale Spring put forward a vision for the future of Carbondale that also included the charge that the city of Carbondale was drastically over-policed. Our basic argument was and remains the following. Carbondale's population, including the students, is actually at or around 20,000. And if that's true, Carbondale has double the number of police of the national average and every other similarly sized college town in Illinois. A lot of you have already seen this graph. Also, we spend double the national average of double the national average and every other similarly sized college town in Illinois. We've also said that the current police pension situation, which is affecting Carbondale and municipalities all around Illinois, are a financial time bomb for the city. And that a lot of what the police are currently asked to do would be done better by a team of care workers, which Dan's going to talk about next. So overall, the gist of what we're saying is if we right-size the Carbondale police budget, we can fund the Carbondale Spring and transform the city for the better. We think this argument is still correct, and that accepting it is an opportunity for us to transform the identity of this town from a floundering college town into a city that's building a future that so many of us here and around the world want and deserve. Tonight, I'm going to address the counter-arguments that we received to our initial arguments in as much detail as I can given our time constraints, but in the coming weeks, I'll be giving an even deeper presentation on this, hopefully on the university, where we'll have 2 hours to just get into the police. If you have questions or comments or objections even, I ask that you either write them down or make a note of them, and then after everybody speaks, we'll have time to talk those things through. So, we know that the Carbondale Police Force, we know how it compares to the national average. But how does it rank, that is, compared to the most policed cities in the country? Like if you were to list the most heavily policed towns with a population between 20,000 and 30,000 in the country, where would Carbondale fall on that list? Well, the answer is it would fall as number 7. And so these numbers are the number of police employees per 10,000 residents. But here's the thing. We know that Carbondale actually has 2 police forces. That is, SIU Public Safety is a 35-person staffed full-time police force. Now, how many of these other cities actually have a second police force? The answer is there's 2 other ones. And, but their police forces for their universities are substantially smaller than Carbondale's. So if you were to take the total number of police employees in the town, including both municipal and on college campuses, and ask how that rates to the population, then the answer is Carbondale is the single most policed city with a population between 20,000 and 30,000 in the country. That's what that says too. Also, thanks to Jason for making this look amazing. And it's not there anymore, but it's also by quite a margin. So if you saw, the gap between Carbondale and the next most policed city is the same as the gap between that next most policed city and the 7th. So, okay. Also, this is already costing us a whole lot. Now, at the public library, you can look at the city's budgets going back to 2002. They're in the stacks. So over the period of about 20 years, the number of the personnel that the CPD has employed has fluctuated between 78 and 86. It kind of went up and then went back down, but it's remained roughly constant. Now, over that same time, right, we see that, so this, just to break this down for you, the orange is the total cost of police services, the greenish thing is the cost just of personnel, and the blue is the cost of retirement, which you see has gone up quite a bit too. I think we were spending about $500,000 in 2002, and now we're spending $2.6 million a year just on police retirement every year. And that's gonna go up. So when we adjust for inflation, which we've done, the cost for maintaining the same size police department has risen 28% since 2002, and it's risen 19% since 2009. So our population has dropped over that time, and yet we are paying more for the same number of police. Now, when we put our arguments forward last spring, we received two substantive counter-arguments from the mayor and city manager, Gary Williams, the mayor Mike Henry. And we'll go through each of these in turn. So the first is that the city of Carbondale has a police department with a high volume of calls for service. And that was 70,240 in 2018. The second is that the city of Carbondale, or the Carbondale community, has asked for a lot of community policing. So first, to address the first argument, which some people have already seen, we've written about this before, but I want to say some new things. So in general, calls for service means, at most other police departments in the country, it means times when people call the police for service, whether it's an emergency or even a non-emergency. But in Carbondale, it means something quite different. So the Carbondale Police Department breaks calls for service into three categories: reactive, proactive, and administrative. Reactive means when somebody calls them for service. Proactive is when they do something and initiate a call. And administrative means their administrative duties. And that includes writing reports and things like that, but it also includes washing their cars. So this is why we say when the mayor justifies the current police budget by referring to calls for service, it's very misleading. But what's even more misleading is that the definition of calls for service by the CPD has changed over the last decade or so. So as the student population dropped, starting around 2008, the number of calls for service increased dramatically. Here's a question, looking at this. When did their definition of calls for service change? So if all of a sudden they expand the definition of calls for service, you would imagine a single sharp increase. But in fact, what we have is this slow creep from about 24,000 in 2007 to 70,000 in 2018, peaking at 83,000 in 2014, which is the year before the Novak Consulting Group did its evaluation of the city government, including the police department. So at this point, I want to offer a hypothesis, if I can find my hypothesis here. Oh, no, let's go on a little further here. That's number 3. Great. Let's look at the proactive calls for service. So remember, calls for service is broken into 3 categories. So there's reactive, proactive, and administrative. We look at the proactive calls for service. We see there's a total of 37,492 reported. Now, a lot of us don't really have a perspective on what would be a normal amount for something like this. So we compared it with the city of Eugene, Oregon. Now, Eugene, Oregon is a city of about 160,000 people, so it's 8 times the size of Carbondale. They have a police department of 333 employees, which is 4 times the size of Carbondale. That's about average for a city their size, but we have one that's double average. So the Carbondale Police report, in the proactive category, 6,571 more police-initiated calls for service than a city that is 8 times the size. But let's look again at those proactive calls for service. So one of these really stands out to me, and that's the category of extra patrols. This is so magical. Just say it and it comes out. That's 16,051 extra patrols, an average of 43 extra patrols per day, 2 an hour, every hour, all day, all year. Now, I want to offer a hypothesis. The Carbondale Police Department knows it is overstaffed. In response to a shrinking population, someone responsible for the statistics began consciously looking for ways to inflate the calls for service numbers to justify their staffing levels. They have defined calls for service in a way that allows them to label all conceivable activity a police officer might do on the job as such, but they still have quite a bit left over, and they've invented the category of extra patrol as a catch-all for all the time that they're doing nothing. This is just a hypothesis, of course. But if you think about it just for a moment, you think about what it would take to actually investigate that hypothesis, you run into another problem. And that is that the police control the statistics that are used to justify their own budget. They have a financial and institutional interest in massaging the numbers to justify the budget, and they are in complete control of the data by which they would be evaluated. So to put it plainly, we are not convinced by the reliance on calls for service as a justification for the current size of the Carbondale police budget, and we hope you aren't either. But what about the second argument? The people of Carbondale want more community policing. Does that adequately justify the size of the current Carbondale police budget? Well, first, let's be clear about something community policing is not. It does not mean that we are policed by people who live in the community or even in the city for that matter. So 80% of Carbondale police officers don't live in Carbondale. So that's not what community policing means. So what does it mean? Well, the first thing you have to know is that the concept of community policing is notoriously vague. It means a lot of different things in a lot of different places where it's implemented. Sometimes it's grouped together with proactive policing. Sometimes it's referred to as problem-solving policing or relational policing. But in practice, community policing takes the form of programs like the Citizens Police Academy, charitable activities, donations to the Boys and Girls Club and other things, Coffee with a Cop, the DARE program, things like that. In essence, what community policing is, it's an umbrella term for all the programs that the police engaged in that are not directly about law enforcement, but are rather about communicating to the public that the police are a supportive part of the community. Now this may sound great to people. For me, I'm very skeptical about government power, and I try to look at it with a critical eye. In the same way that we know that we have to do with corporate power, right? When corporations face scandals, then they engage in rebranding and PR campaigns. Now, I think that when we look at community policing within a historical context, it starts to look very different. So, let's do that very briefly. Now, until 1964, in the Civil Rights Act, one of the main tasks of police in America was to enforce a racial caste system in this country. Segregation, first in chattel slavery and then in the Jim Crow laws. This caste system was not just a matter of racist beliefs in people's heads. It was actually an organized form of violence that was supported and threatened by the police, and it was normalized as something that was orderly. Now, when activists challenged this caste system and said, even if it's orderly, it's not just, the police responded to them. And they responded to them with surveillance, harassment, beating them up, framing them, locking them up, and murdering them. Realizing that the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, the legal equalities that were won through the struggles of the early civil rights movement, were insufficient to stop police terror on minority communities, activist groups like the Black Panthers and others, they started to do armed patrols of their own neighborhoods, providing self-defense for their communities and monitoring the police in them. And this was sometimes called community policing. That is, people from the community taking self-defense into their own hands. The FBI responded to this by intensifying its COINTELPRO program. Just as a strange note, everyone knows that this theater that we're in was actually the segregated portion of the Varsity. You all know that? That was desegregated by activists like Dick Gregory. Well, you can look up Dick Gregory's FBI file and get a sense of what I'm talking about here.
He's got a great story about how he desegregated it.
Yeah, he desegregated this building here.
By sitting in the front row.
That's right. So this history that I'm talking about is the architecture that we're living, too. I'll give you some time. Great. But so the FBI responded to this community-based policing effort with ramping up COINTELPRO, which was a secret campaign of assassinations, frame-ups, propaganda, and surveillance in collaboration with local police departments. But for many in America, the damage had actually been done. The damage to the perceived legitimacy of the police. They were viewed as an occupying force, protecting the interests of a wealthy, mostly white ruling class. Community policing, as we know it, was developed as a response to this situation. A hearts and minds campaign attempting to restore the perceived legitimacy of the police. But during this same era of community policing, there were other changes happening in the police in America. So since that time, we've seen the largest expansion of incarceration in the history of the world. And these rates of incarceration are, of course, heavily racialized. There's heavy racial disparity in that. But also, we've seen the militarization of local police forces, the purchasing of military weapons and training in military tactics for domestic deployment. We had a video that was actually taken from the Carbondale Police's recruiting video that came up a few months back, but it didn't make it into the slide. But you can look that up. So all of that and much else alongside the development of community policing. Now, a lot of us are well aware of the dangers of an authoritarian government, the way the police can be deployed to disrupt political movements, but too often we think about these things in different aspects, in isolation from one another. What I want to do is I want to invite you to consider that these are three parts of a single development, a single trajectory in American policing. The community policing is the velvet glove, the public relations campaign that steers our attention from the mass incarceration, the militarization, and the general extension of police power into our lives. A society that is deeply unequal, which is also a pattern that increased much under this same era that we're talking about. But a society that's deeply unequal relies on more and more force to hold it together. But that force never appears legitimate. So there needs to be a constant campaign to reestablish the perceived legitimacy of those who enact the force. There's another phenomenon that's happened during this period, and that's what some scholars call the punitive turn in social welfare and criminal justice policy. So often under the rhetoric of fiscal responsibility or shrinking the size of government, the US has devoted more and more resources to policing and prisons as a means of managing poverty and its effects. In 2009, here's a local example. In 2009, the city of Carbondale eliminated $100,000 from the I Can Read program in Addicts Community Services, which ran a daycare center out of the Irma Hayes Center. According to then city manager Alan Gill, this was out of purely fiscal concerns, saying that the city couldn't afford to run a child care service at a deficit. I guess it's not worth it to take care of children if you're not making a profit. Now, that same year, the personnel costs for the police, the same year that they couldn't find $100,000 to support a child care service, the personnel costs for the police went up $237,000. So, also, the following year, the city sold the Irma Hayes Center to a local nonprofit, offloading substantial utility costs from the city onto people who wanted to keep the building open. But they also built a $7 million new public safety center. I should also mention, around this same time was the same year that James Gaddis, a Carbondale police officer, robbed First Southern Bank. Do y'all remember that? Just think for a second. A lot of people here are involved in like local community groups. Imagine if someone from your community group robbed a bank. Like, would you as a group have to deal with any like pressure or like consequences from that? So they got a brand new building and rates. So that's all. But so the point I'm trying to make, right, is that this small transfer of wealth in the city is symptomatic of a much wider trend, and that's a transfer of priorities, where there's always enough money to grow the policing and incarceration apparatus, but there's never enough money to actually relieve poverty or the stresses that face poor and working people. I want to make one last point about community policing, and that is that it functions as a sort of magic trick. It transforms criticism of the police into a justification for their expansion. And here's how the trick works. So the first thing that happens, the first step in the trick, is that the police mess up. They harass people, they beat somebody up, or they kill somebody, right? They mess up. And then a group of activists calls them out and threatens their perceived legitimacy. But then another group of activists, a moderate group, comes and says, oh my gosh, what happened is terrible. Yes, we need to improve police-community relations. We need more community policing. And then finally, the police go to the elected officials or the city government and they say, oh, you know, these people are right. We need more resources because we need to improve our police-community relations. We need to do this community policing thing, and that's resource intensive. intensive. And voila, you've transformed a moment of criticism into an opportunity to expand police power. This is the cycle that we need to break. So, and we want to break that cycle by actually defunding the police and creating a police force that's of an appropriate size for this community. So here's our response, ultimately, to the mayor and to the city manager's second argument. Yes, we need people to build community, and they need to be paid, and that's serious work that should be the city's responsibility. And yes, we need people to respond to situations of violence, but who told us those should be the same people? We're asking for a normal-sized police force and a serious investment in building the kind of compassionate community that the people of Carbondale want and deserve. And all this will take is a transfer of the city's priorities to turn back the tide of those confused priorities that got us to this point. So what might this look like? Well, this is the 2020 planned Carbondale budget. Let's imagine that over the next 2 years, the people in this room, not just the people on this stage, but all of us, decide we want to have a normal-sized police department and we want to fund the initiatives that you're about to hear about. Well, we don't know what's going to happen with the pension thing. It's a complicated monster of a mess. So let's assume that even if we reduce the number of personnel, we're still going to have a constant retirement obligation. But over the next 2 years, by reducing the number of police employees down to an average size, we can free up $4.5 million to save this ailing world, or at least this ailing city. That's all I have to say for now. If you have any questions I ask that you hold them for the end, or you can also email us at carbondalespring.org. Thank you very much for listening to me.